Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 166 and I am the show's host Kyle. On this episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing the planned talks between Donald Trump and North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong Un. Specifically, I'm going to be discussing an article from the Washington Post by Matt Boot titled North Korea and South Korea Snooker Trump. In the article, Matt Boot makes a lot of common critiques of the planned talks between North Korea and Donald Trump. So I'm going to go through his article to explain why those critiques are wrong and that the talks are generally a positive thing and I think something to definitely be celebrated. And if you're the type of person that wants to look for something to congratulate Donald Trump for and to see a positive in his presidency, this is certainly one of the very few. This show will also double as the first episode of a bonus podcast I'm doing for my Patreon supporters, where I'm going to take 2 Matt Boot columns a month and then just kind of go through and debunk them. I think this will be a good opportunity for me to take on the mainstream narrative of a lot of these different conflicts and wars because, Matt Boot writes on all of them from North Korea to Syria. He's, constantly writing these articles where he brings up the mainstream neocon talking points. So this is going to be a free episode, but in the future, if you want those, like I said, 2 a month, if you subscribe, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, with all that, I will finally get into today's episode. I'm going to start by summarizing the Matt Boot article. So, none of the opinions expressed here are my own and all of Matt Boot. And I'm just going to go through the article. That way you understand it. I'll also link to it on the show notes page. This isn't a very long one, so you read it in a couple minutes if you like. All right, Matt Boot starts out by pointing out that South Korea had 2 concerns coming in to the Trump presidency era of relations with North Korea. And that is 1, Trump would either go to war with North Korea, or 2, Trump would sell out South Korea. He goes on to say that through the first year, it was pretty much all the concern of the first that we are going to go to war with North Korea. Of course, you have fire and fury. My button is bigger than yours. And all this other rhetoric coming from both sides, Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un. And this one as far as the U.S. threatening a bloody nose strike against North Korea. Now, incoherently, Trump has suddenly changed his mind and is now willing to talk to Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Un has the worst human rights record on the planet. The meeting will give Kim Jong Un what he wants most, and that is legitimacy. And this is going to give Kim Jong Un the ability to tell his own people that Trump and the Americans will kowtow to North Korea now that they have nuclear weapons. Matt Boot references a tweet that Trump sent out a couple months ago where Trump was critiquing the rest of the world and the former American presidents for placating North Korea in the past and giving them what he referred to as extortion money. Matt Boot goes on to give a couple examples. One, he says that we gave some relief after North Korea has acted belligerently in the past, and so this is kind of the same thing, that North Korea went and did all these crazy things, launched these missiles, and now we're possibly going to give them some relief or move off the Korean Peninsula for them to no longer do those things, and that's problematic. Matt Boot also references the Sunshine Policy and how that basically just gave the North Koreans a bunch of free money. Matt Boot also points out that North Korea has went back on deals in the past, including the 1994 Agreement Framework. Now, he concedes that Moon and Kim are, of course, just South Korea's president. His name is Moon Jae-in. President Moon is what he typically goes by. But the 2 leaders are looking to snooker Trump for their own reasons. He does concede that Moon Jae-in does have a somewhat legitimate reason in being scared that a lot of his people, millions of his people, would die. Matt Boot doesn't say millions, but his people would die in a war. And he points out how, Kim Jong-un is probably doing this double cross where he's saying that he's not going to test his missiles, but he's secretly working on them anyways. And so this really doesn't hurt or set back the North Korean missile program. He says that South Korea claims that North Korea wants to talk about giving up their nukes, but South Korea knows that the terms that North Korea would give up their nukes under are terms that the Americans wouldn't accept anyway. But he says that if North Korea, if Trump goes in and takes the deal where North Korea gives up their nukes in exchange for a peace deal and for American troops to withdraw from the Korean Peninsula, this would set up a situation where North Korea could invade and take over and unite the Korean Peninsula under the communist Kim Jong Un banner. And he says that Trump, because of the lack of experts in the State Department, would take this deal, but points out that Trump doesn't usually pay attention to his experts anyways, citing the tariffs that just got put in place. Matt Spoot does admit that the North Koreans here may not be looking to take over the whole Korean Peninsula and may just be looking for some sanctions relief, which Matt Spoot admits are starting to bite the North Koreans. Matt Spoot complains that the United States rushed into these talks without getting anything in return, and he finishes up by saying that it may be responsible to have talks at a lower level, but what Trump needs to do here is continue the maximum pressure campaign until Kim Jong Un comes begging for talks. Alright, so that's, the summary of the Matt Spoot article. And now my plan is to just kind of go through the article, not necessarily line by line, but start out that way and kind of break off and talk about things as I think they tie together and come up best. So when Matt Spoot starts off the article, he kind of sets the stage by saying that everything in South Korea has what I guess generally consistent, but the big change was Donald Trump taking office, and everybody's worried that they're either going to end up at war or end up with North Korea taking over the whole peninsula. Now, he really doesn't cite anything to make it clear as to why he believes this was the case. The threat of war with North Korea has existed for a long time, with tensions really heating up in 2002 after George Bush and John Bolton scotched the agreed framework deal. But there's a lot of other things that were going on in South Korea leading up to the 2016 elections in the United States, and then really going forward in the first year of Trump's presidency, that I also think are worth pointing out and very significant. I believe it was the summer of 2016 where there's an investigation of the former South Korean president, President Park. She was eventually, I believe, indicted and convicted of corruption charges and removed from office in October of 2016. The South Koreans then planned an election that I believe occurred in 2017 with, at some point, the new president Moon Jae-in being sworn in May of 2017. Now, during that election, the former leader, President Park, was a member of the right-wing party in South Korea. It tends to be that if you're on the right, you're in favor of a more hostile, aggressive sanction style policy with North Korea, where if you're on the left, you're in favor of the sunshine policy, policies that bring North and South Korea together culturally and look for ways to avoid war. Candidate Moon Jae-in ran on a platform where he was very much in favor and, even talked about reinstating the sunshine policy, which he was a part of the administration, the former administration that implemented that policy back in 1996. And favored talks and peace with the North Koreans. And I think he even suggested as he was running talks with Kim Jong Un. He ends up winning the election. And so this is a sign that peace is a popular idea in South Korea. And, that's something worth noting. And if you're an American and your idea is that, we're supposed to, I guess, protect the South Korean people, but at the same time, I guess, we have to allow the other countries a way of self-determination. If they want to have peace with the North Koreans, then that's, I think, something that the United States would have to respect, or should, at least. Other things going on, there is a peace movement in South Korea, like a popular anti-war movement. A lot of protests against the THAAD missile systems that were deployed in South Korea. The people didn't want them there. They saw them as having more hostilities with their neighboring countries. And so it's not like the United States policy, the policy that Matt Spoot is advocating for, is necessarily a popular policy in South Korea. Now, Matt Spoot summarizes Trump's first year as being completely hawkish against North Korea. And I do agree that was the trend. But on several occasions, Trump said things that were much less hawkish and suggested that he was willing to talk with Kim Jong Un. At one point, this was pretty recently, he said it would be worth talking to Kim Jong Un if there was just a 10 or 20% chance that he could talk him out of his nuclear weapons. So I think that's an overgeneralization. And this move, while it took everybody by surprise, Trump accepting this agreement for talks, with the general trend of the Trump presidency being so surprising all over the place, and the fact that Trump had signaled that he would be willing to talk to Kim Jong Un if denuclearization was a possibility, I guess this isn't as big of a flip-flop as it may seem initially. Matt Spoot even goes so far as to describe this as head-snapping incoherence and that Trump is legitimizing the Kim regime. So, while somewhat incoherent, this simply isn't the most incoherent policy that Trump has faced or, gone about establishing. As far as the legitimacy part, I think this is like really a fake argument, and a really dangerous fake argument that has prevented a lot of crises from being resolved. If you look at who the Americans have been willing to do deals with in the past, I mean, FDR worked with Stalin during World War II. Nixon went and had détente with China under Mao. I mean, these are the two biggest mass murderers in the history of the world, Mao and Stalin, even over Hitler. And so the United States could do deals with them. I mean, we sold Iran under the Shah weapons. We sold Saddam Hussein weapons. We had the extraordinary rendition program under Bush, where we were sending people to Assad and Gaddafi and Mossadegh in Egypt to be tortured. We sell Saudi Arabia to this day billions of dollars worth of weapons that they're using to go to Yemen and commit genocide. And so it's not like America has a standard where we only talk or do deals with good people. As far as it goes giving legitimacy, I really don't see how this is the case. I mean, everybody knows who the North Koreans are and who Kim Jong Un is. Donald Trump going over there and talking to them, especially with Donald Trump's reputation, isn't going to grant Kim Jong Un any legitimacy at all. We had Donald Trump going to the Philippines during his Asian tour, and you had the president there, Rodrigo Duterte, who has waged an absolutely bloody and brutal war against his own people, a drug war. And it really didn't change anything, Donald Trump going to visit. In fact, after a couple very bad PR publicity stunts, Duterte actually shut down the drug war for quite a few months. And so you can see it's not like the visit of Donald Trump is something that gives a leader legitimacy to commit atrocities against his own people. That obviously didn't happen with the situation in the Philippines. I find it much harder to know how the meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un would impact the people in North Korea and their relationship or perception of their government. I don't think anyone quite knows how much real control and authority that Kim Jong-un has over the country, how many concessions that he has to make to the military generals, to the farmers, to the people, to the oligarchs, every little different power faction in North Korea in order to maintain his control on power. But most people do know that the North Korean government controls most, if not all, the information that goes out to the North Korean people. And so I'm sure the North Koreans have the technology and the ability to Photoshop some pictures of Donald Trump shaking hands with Kim Jong-un and send that out to all the people, if that's the information that they want the people to have. The meeting actually occurring or not, I don't think grants Kim Jong-un any legitimacy among his own people. Another problem with this argument is that you could always make this argument. If you ever do a deal with anybody who's doing something immoral, then that somebody could say that you're giving them legitimacy by doing the deal. And so this is something that you're always going to have to contend with. But I think time and time again, you've seen that we've done these kind of deals. In the cases where you stick with it a little bit more, it tends to work and reduce tensions. If you look at, we really improved our relationship with China, and to the point where millions, if not billions of people, or no, 1 billion people have been benefited by the trade between the United States and China. I mean, there's hundreds of millions of Chinese that have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Of course, the low-cost goods that China sells to the United States provides the lower class of America with cheap, inexpensive goods that improves their lifestyle. And so, that relationship has been very, positive both ways. And it's because that Nixon was willing to go over there and shake hands with a terrible person. And so, you can't always force a leader out of a country. That's up to the people who live in that country. And just because America wants to be moral police of the world doesn't necessarily mean that we could always really accomplish those ends. And sometimes the best deal is to make a deal with whoever's in power, expose the people to the wealth that, you and your people live under. I'm sure if the North Korean people meet South Korean people, they're probably extremely jealous of the technology that they have. South Korea, especially Seoul, is a Western country, with massive amounts of wealth and a high living standard. And so, people tend to want to live better lives. And so if you expose them to the better lives, then they'll pine for more freedoms and liberty. All right, Matt Spoot's next complaint is that Kim Jong-un is going to cheat on the deal, so America shouldn't do the deal anyways. Now, the first thing I would point out is that if one side needs to be worried about the other side cheating on the deal, I don't think it's the Americans. If you look at the examples that Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi set, where these leaders gave up their weapons of mass destruction and then were later attacked by the Americans, the same now with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. that the Americans don't have a good track record of being faithful on their deals to not attack people. Of course, you could also look at the Iran nuclear deal now, which kind of tells North Korea that, hey, if we make a deal with the Americans, it may change the next time they have a new president. You also have to look at it from the perspective too that America is the world power, and in any war between the United States and North Korea, the Americans would absolutely wipe out the North Koreans. Now, the North Koreans may be able to inflict some damage on the Americans. I'm not trying to deny that aspect of it, but if you're looking at which side is going to win that war and which side would absolutely be obliterated in the war, the North Koreans stand no chance. Matt Spoot also cites the agreed framework, which he claims that the North Koreans reneged on. That's not what happened. It was John Bolton and the Americans that really ended up scotching that deal in 2002. The Americans made a lot of promises to the North Koreans that they didn't follow through on in the agreed framework that was agreed upon under Clinton. You also had other steps too, where the Sunshine Policy was moving positively. The Clinton administration was doing a lot of good negotiations with the North Koreans, which was completely reversed as soon as George W. Bush took office in 2001. And in fact, I mean, Bill Clinton almost signed a missile deal with the North Koreans right at the end of the year 2000. And in part it was, I believe, the uncertainty about the results of the 2000 election that kept Bill Clinton from traveling to North Korea and maybe signing that deal. I also think there's this idea that Matt Spoot brings up, and that's a lot of mainstream commentators bring up about not just the North Koreans, but the Iranians and the Russians and anybody viewed as an enemy of the Americans. And that is the idea that, well, Kim Il-sung was dishonest, Kim Jong Un was dishonest, and so the grandson obviously just the same level of dishonest and untrustable as the first two. He's a completely separate person. I think he has Western education too. It's not like this is somebody who's just lived in North Korea his whole life and has only read the books that his father allowed him to read. And so, I mean, he's been in a very difficult position since the time that he took office at a very young age, and I don't want to praise somebody who has committed such terrible human rights records. But it does seem like just from, a military strategic position that he's been able to secure and strengthen his own position. And so it's not like he's an irrational actor. It's not like he's going to do something that's going to immediately lead to nuclear war. I mean, he's made smart decisions as far as keeping himself in power. And starting a war with the United States would absolutely be the one thing that removes him from power. And so I don't think it necessarily made sense from the perspective of Kim Jong Un to just be this, tricky little North Korean guy that Matt Spoot stereotypes him as. And like I said, this extends too to the way we look at the Russians and the Iranians. The Russians are always looking to covertly undermine America because that's what Russians do. I think it was Mike Huckabee who said that all the Iranians want to do is just kill Jews, and that's, just the way they want to be. And that's, the way that they're driven to be, is that those damn Persians just, all they want to do is conquer the Middle East. However, those, kind of generalizations are not only extremely racist, but they're also stupid and will lead you to following through with bad policies like what's going on here with Matt Spoot. Matt Spoot also complains that North Korea has this idea where they act really provocatively and then they're going to get paid off by Western countries to not act so provocatively. Now, first, you have to look at the situation that the United States also acts very provocatively against North Korea as well. We fly missions and do bombing runs over the DMZ all the time. This is the border of North Korea that there's like a bombing range, and we drop bombs there and we fly planes over there. We have tens of thousands of U.S. troops in that region. We have our THAAD anti-missile systems there. We test our Minuteman missiles into the Pacific Ocean to let North Korea know that we could bomb them. A lot of times we call this show of force, and we'll put 3 aircraft carriers in the region and we'll fly bombing missions near them. And this is supposed to intimidate the North Koreans. Of course, Kim Jong Un has no idea when those, fighter planes will just travel north of the 38th parallel and do what the United States has threatened to be a bloody nose attack against the North Koreans. And so the actions of the United States have been very provocative against the North Koreans. And remember, as I pointed out before, that the North Koreans would not win this war, and they absolutely know that. Of course, as Matt Booth cited in his own article, Trump traded the fire and fury threats and the, my button is bigger than your threats with North Korea. And so the Americans have been acting very provocatively as well. In part, I think that it's less the North Koreans acting provocatively and, just trying to advance their nuclear and missile programs as a deterrent against being attacked by the Americans. It's worth mentioning that the stated goal of the North Korean nuclear weapons program and missile program is not to be able to wipe out the West. I read an article once speculating that the North Koreans were developing these weapons to launch a secret attack against first South Korea, then Japan, then the United States, and essentially extend their empire to control, I guess, all of Japan and South Korea, and then nuke the western coast of the United States until they get a deal. There's no indication that this is a North Korean plan at all. And in fact, they said that the only reason we're developing these nuclear weapons is so that if you attack us, we have something to hate you back with to make you not want to attack us in the first place. Of course, have cited the examples of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and said, hey, look, here's how you treat people who don't have these weapons, and I don't want to die like that. There's a couple other points to be made here. First, we had China proposing at the beginning of Trump's term the freeze for a freeze deal, and this would have just basically told both countries to knock off their provocations and for North Korea to stop testing and doing testing to advance their programs, and the Americans passed up on this deal. And so it kind of shows that either we're not concerned about the North Korean provocations or that the North Korean provocations really don't mean anything to the Americans. And so it's not like we're trading them, to stop the provocations. It's also worth noting that in the agreement leading up to talks, the North Koreans said, hey, if we're going to have talks, we're not going to test any more missiles, and the United States is going to continue their provocations in the war games that simulate the invasion of North Korea anyways. And so I think it's very misleading for Matt Booth to say what he's saying here, that the North Koreans are just looking for money in exchange for not acting provocatively, because they've been willing to not act provocatively just to talk to Trump. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the Sunshine Policy, because Matt Booth claims that this just gave North Korea some money and that these kind of policies only appease and empower the North Korean regime. Going back, I think the Sunshine Policy was started in 1994 under a liberal administration which the current president of South Korea, President Moon, was a part of. The idea was to bring North and South Koreans together along the 38th parallel, the border that divides North and South Korea. And I think they were working together at factories. I think families who were separated by the armistice deal where the North and South Korea were broken into two countries were able to visit each other. And the idea is to improve cultural, economic, and diplomatic relations, and so that there's a general movement in both countries, and aimed towards peace. This was pretty successful. It led to talks, I believe, in the year either 1998 or 2000 between the South Korean leader and Kim Jong Un's father, Kim Jong Il, where they agreed to have a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. And of course, this was a standard that both the North and South Koreans held to until 2002, when John Bolton and the United States really forced North Korea out of the agreed framework and were no longer members of the deal. The agreed framework was the deal where, somewhat similar to the Iranian deal, the North Koreans would agree to limit their nuclear energy programs to take them further away from having nuclear weapons, and even the United States even agreed to give them a couple nuclear reactors in exchange for them storing less plutonium or something like that could one day be weaponized. A lot of people point out that the North Koreans were cheating on the deal. They may have been cheating on the deal a little bit, but the Americans weren't living up to their end of the deal either, and hadn't delivered any of the nuclear reactors that they had promised to the North Korea. And like I said, the Sunshine Policy occurred during a time where we have the Clinton administration making deals with the North Koreans. We have Madeleine Albright visiting Kim Jong-il. And like I said, Clinton almost going to visit Kim Jong-il and sign a missile deal. And so if you look at the time when things were going the best as far as relations between the United States and North Korea, and the lowest chance of war between the two countries, and going back before a time that North Korea even had nuclear weapons or, was close to achieving ICBM potential, we almost had a deal. And so it doesn't make sense that you would necessarily dismiss out of hand that having this deal put back in place would be a good thing, and that we can maybe once again reunite some movement in a positive direction. Matt Spoot does make like a 1 sentence concession here that what President Moon is clearly trying to do is stop a war between North and South Korea. I think it's worth noting that like if war broke out, we're talking about millions of South Korean lives. Now imagine if Kim Jong Un is able to deliver a hydrogen bomb to the center of Seoul. I mean, we're talking about millions of people. I don't even know how many millions of people dead in that attack of South Korean people. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans. Of course, we have the military members there, their families. There's so much business between the two countries. I mean, you're talking about a lot of South Korean lives, a lot of American lives that would be ended if a war broke out. And so, yeah, President Moon wants to do this, but Matt Spoot should really recognize that the weight and the reason why he wants to do this is because we're talking about millions of lives on his side of the border. And of course, millions of lives on the north side of that border as well. Matt Spoot also complains that North Korea is only suspending its missile tests and is probably secretly carrying out research on their missiles and trying to achieve the ability to hit America with an ICBM. And yeah, I don't know, that's probably happening. I'm guessing that the North Koreans aren't completely stopping research on their ICBM program, but they're doing this anyways. The fact that they're stopping testing their missiles is a really good thing because this is one of those accidental triggers that could lead to a nuclear war breaking out. And so it's a step in the right direction. The North Koreans are putting something on the table. The Americans aren't putting anything on the table at all. And so it's not like the Americans are giving a concession. The North Koreans are just stopping their missile testing program. And yet this is something that this guy's, Matt Spoot is complaining about. He also speculates that South Korea tells the United States that North Korea is willing to offer their nuclear, to denuclearize, but they're likely not going to make that offer for something that's a good enough deal for the Americans, and the South Koreans know this. I don't know if that's true. I mean, it seems to me that if the South Koreans knew that there was a poison pill in the North Korean deal, then they wouldn't have offered the talks to the Americans in the first place. I think if you look at how the Americans have operated, in which the neocons are always looking to immediately throw up their hands and say, well, we tried everything, so now we have to bomb them. That's something that the South Koreans should probably know and anticipate. And so I don't think they would necessarily offer these talks if they didn't think that there was legitimate progress to be made here. And also, it's just wild speculation by Matt Spoot. He has no idea what the North Koreans are offering here. Alright, so now I want to talk about Matt Spoot's scenario here that he lays out and presents. What he says is that North Korea is going to offer to denuclearize in exchange for the Americans leaving the Korean Peninsula and a peace deal. Now, I'm sure there would be a lot of other terms, sanctions, relief, and stuff like that to the deal. But he then says that the North Koreans, that Trump would foolishly accept this, thinking that it's a win, and then the North Koreans go on to take over the entire Korean Peninsula. So this is fear-mongering at its absolute worst. First of all, it seems pretty unlikely to me that North Korea and Donald Trump get together for the first time and then they shake hands on a deal for the Americans to withdraw from the Korean Peninsula. I think we're a long way off from that. Even if these talks go well on the first round, that there's a lot of trust but verify thing. There has to be some goodwill built up between the two countries. Because as I point out, there's been a lot of hostilities between the two countries in the past. The Americans have gone back on deals, not only with North Korea, but other examples. And so I'm sure both sides are going to be cautious when dealing with each other. And first steps to this deal may not be immediate withdrawal of American troops from the Korean Peninsula, but maybe an agreement to sell a Korean delegation to DC. Or maybe for like a sports game between the Americans and the North Koreans, or some visits between North and South Koreans, or something like that. So the idea that North Korea is going to denuclearize, sign a peace deal with the Americans, and then invade and take over the Korean Peninsula is completely ridiculous, right? And Kim Jong Un has to know this. If you look at North Korea's weaponry right now, I mean, they have the nukes, but those are a deterrent missile. They can't really use that. I mean, I guess they could use that to wipe out the South Korean people. But what Matt Spoot is really talking about here is an invasion where they take over South Korea and not turn it into a nuclear wasteland. You also have the issue that if the Americans are going to withdraw, then Kim Jong Un is giving up his nuclear weapons, and so they no longer have that weapon in their arsenal. The other main weapon that North Korea has is a lot of artillery that's pointed at Seoul. While I'm sure this would be useful if they were trying to maybe invade South Korea or something like that, this isn't necessarily going to allow them to take over the whole Korean Peninsula. These are defensive positions that they could use to attack Seoul and an invading army if needed. So it's a deterrent weapon coupled with a defensive weapon. North Korea, I apparently has a 1 million man army. I'm not sure how accurate those numbers are or how many of these guys actually have guns and boots and training. I've seen some pictures and some of these guys look awfully old. If you look at the North Korean soldier that defected the last time, I mean, this guy wasn't in good health, right? And so I don't think the North Koreans have a very strong army or invasion force that they could necessarily use to take over South Korea. South Korea, on the other hand, has a very good military that's been mainly bought and paid for by the United States. I mean, they have the THAAD missile systems. They have an aircraft carrier, they have assets, and they have bought American-made weapons and planes before. Not to mention you have the American base at Guam and the American base in Okinawa, Japan, where we have a aircraft carrier stationed. So even if we move the U.S. troops out of South Korea, it doesn't necessarily mean, one, that the Americans aren't in the region or that the American Army and Navy wouldn't be able to support the South Koreans if the North Koreans were invading. But it's also not clear that if the Americans withdrew and North Korea denuclearized, that the South Koreans aren't the military power on that peninsula then. And so I don't know if Matt Spoot just didn't think of that or didn't calculate that in, but it's certainly not a guarantee. And it's pretty unlikely that North Korea would try to invade South Korea or would even be able to if they wanted to. And then after he goes through his dire fear-mongering scenario, he says, well, the North Koreans may just want some sanctions relief, though, which is likely the case, right? That the North Koreans don't want to take over the whole Korean Peninsula because that would result like millions of dead Koreans on both sides, and the North Koreans probably won't have the capability once denuclearized anyways. And also, isn't this the point of having sanctions in the first place, is so that you could take them off of people in exchange for them making concessions that you want? So the North Koreans are willing to denuclearize in exchange for taking off sanctions. This was the point of the sanctions being there in the first place. So Matt Spoot, I guess, then gives his recommendation to Trump, which is maybe allow some low-level talks, maintain the maximum pressure campaign, and force North Korea to come to the table on their hands and their knees. Peter Van Buren points out in his article that I'll link in the show notes page that the low-level talks are relatively pointless. Kim Jong Un drives the North Korean policy, and as we've seen, the executive pretty much controls America's foreign policy in America as well. And so having Trump's talks with people below the Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump wouldn't be counterproductive or anything like that. But at the same time, they aren't the people that drive the policy, and so they would just be less effective. Having the immediate talks between Trump and Kim Jong-un will allow progress to actually be made. So you have this really interesting thing here, where North Korea is willing to stop missile testing, offer up their nuclear program, and wants to engage in talks with America. And Matt Spoot says this is a terrible thing and we shouldn't agree to the talks. And then his policy recommendation, he says we should keep up the sanctions. That way the North Koreans come to the table willing to give things up. That's exactly what they're doing right now. And so his policy recommendations are obviously ridiculous and contradictory and don't really make sense and are likely only to lead to more war. One more subject I want to talk about that came up in his article, and that is Matt Spoot brings up this idea that Trump doesn't have any experts in his administration on North Korea, and I heard a lot of people talking about this who are critical of the Trump policy. Now, there isn't a U.S. ambassador to Seoul, South Korea right now, and the ambassador that Trump had nominated that had since withdrawn their name. They do have I guess de facto ambassador in South Korea right now, whoever's highest ranking there, is a guy named Mark Napper, that Peter Van Buren points out has a very good relationship with the South Koreans and is in a good position to help, negotiate the situation there. One of the things I think we have seen from the Trump administration that's been misrepresented, especially in the State Department, is that Trump not appointing ambassadors doesn't necessarily mean that America has nobody in that country to negotiate with that country. We do have other people there in our embassies, and just leaving the highest ranking person there to be in charge rather than nominating and appointing somebody new. A man by the name of Joseph Yun, who I guess was the person that kind of would handle the relationship between the North Koreans and the Americans from the American side as far as arranging the talks, on the more logistical side, recently retired. And Peter Van Buren points out that that's a real loss, but he's replaced by a man named Mark Lambert, who Peter Van Buren believes is qualified to do that. Like I said, I'll link to that article on the show notes page. A couple other things I want to address apart from the Matt Spoot article. One is why now is somewhat important as to, why we're getting the agreement on talks now, why Kim Jong Un's reaching out now, why Donald Trump said yes. The first, and I think, one of the very valuable ones, is President Moon of South Korea has really been pushing forward towards this. And so that's been a big factor in it. We also had the Olympic Games happening recently and pushing things in a positive direction. From the North Korean side, I think they pretty much maximized their nuclear deterrent, or what they could really achieve for now. They have at least convinced the world that they have a hydrogen bomb and a long-range ballistic missile, possibly an intercontinental ballistic missile, but at the very least they could threaten the Americans and our allies enough to make it a deterrent. And so from Kim Jong Un's perspective, I think North Korea is probably in the greatest position of strength that they could be in. And so it would make sense for him to reach out at this point. I'll go ahead and address, I saw a interview with Daniel L. Davies, who's a retired lieutenant colonel and definitely somebody who wants peace in the Korean Peninsula, saying that he believes this is in part because of the pressure that Donald Trump has put on North Korea. It's hard to know how true this is, but it's definitely a theory that I've heard a lot of Trump supporters float, which is the idea that Trump is basically acting belligerently on the world stage to force local actors to step up. So in this situation with Israel and Palestine, by Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem, it makes America no longer a partisan actor in the whole thing, and would force maybe the UN or regional actors, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, somebody to take charge of the negotiations there. Same thing with South Korea, that by saying that we're going to attack North Korea, that really puts pressure on the South Koreans and President Moon to start making deals or moving towards some kind of deal with the North Koreans. I don't know if that's true. It sounds a little bit preposterous to me and very likely to backfire, and I definitely don't think that if that's what Trump did this time is a foreign policy move that he should try to replicate. But I guess, I don't have any immediate evidence to say, oh yeah, that's definitely not happening. He also points out that maybe, the threats scared Kim Jong Un to the table. Again, I don't know if this is true. I think that from the perspective of Kim Jong Un, that North Korea is probably in a stronger position now than when Trump took office and under Obama. Last thing I want to address a little bit is this idea of what to expect. And Jonathan Marshall talked about this in an article posted on Consortium News that, again, I'll link to in the show notes page. But basically he said that, progress on the talks may be slow, or maybe they get together and talk and there's really nothing that they could come to in terms of a deal or agreement to move forward. And one of the dangers here is that, it's billed as a loss for Donald Trump, and then you have Donald Trump starting to act recklessly because, he's getting blasted for it in the media or something like that. So I think that's something that, is worth keeping our eyes on and being a little bit worried about. But again, as I said in the beginning, expect slow progress. This is Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un, so who knows what could happen. Maybe they're best friends by the end of this and they come out and say, hey, yeah, they're denuclearizing and we're going to remove our troops from Korea and it's all good now. But like I said, my guess is that we see slow progress here, trust but verify, trying to build a good relationship to eventually lead to one day denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. Alright, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Again, if you like this show and you want to hear more of me debunking Matt's boot, check out patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Sign up as a donor there and then you'll get these shows twice a month. For all of my Foreign Policy Focus episodes is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, Libertarian Union on Facebook, at KYAAALE on Twitter, and of course, Immersion News is a brand new news website that I have out that you all should check out because you're absolutely going to love it. Thanks everyone.